we only covered virtue ethics per se, and I tried to show you what I thought at least was beneficial towards that, right? In the sense that we're asking not what is the right thing to do, but how ought we be as individuals. And I also at least tried to express that there's goods and limitations on it. So the goods are that at least we can have some hope and assurance that a person who's developed good virtue is going to act in a virtuous way. But that's the downfall, is that there's no guarantee that a person who is typically virtuous would not act out of character. Plus, there's always the application to very specific things. Again, I would like to think, and I do think, there's a connection between a virtuous person and the ability for them to do their job well. But if I really had to come down to it, somebody who's designing a bridge, I wouldn't care if they had 3 people on the side and they're married. I want that bridge to be done well, right? So, I mean, there's those issues too. And we'll talk about the pros and cons of these things as we move through. Today we're going to look at consequentialism, deontology, and what we'll call principlism. And then part of principlism, even though it's not in the text, it wasn't covered, is the principle of double effect. I'll explain that as we get moving along. All right. Now, first off, the thing with consequentialism is, if we could broadly understand, and this was a ethical theory developed particularly by John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham, and such. You're really trying to determine what is the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And it's, by its name, it's consequence-oriented. So what is the goal? So you can see already we're not talking about what the virtue of the individual is what's going to happen in the end. All right? There's some good things about this, and there's some bad things. That's always how it is when we try to apply these ethical systems, per se. There's a few different types of, well, I shouldn't say there's a few. There's probably a dozen plus different variations on this, and it's typically the most popular, if you want to call it that, the most popular of ethical systems. If we talk about ego-centered consequentialism, remember in the beginning of the course I told you there's no such thing as a default ethic? I mean, you have to choose something. Well, that's only sort of true, because if people have a default ethic, this would probably be it. They just determine, what should I do now, what's in my best interest, and if I'm not going to think beyond that, it's going to be an egotistical form of ethics that they will apply just so that they can get the greatest happiness out of whatever's going on at a particular time, right? So what maximizes pain and minimizes pleasure? Now, on the surface, that seems like a no-duh type ethical system. I mean, isn't that what we're after? Well, we do a lot of things, though, in life that don't necessarily bring us pleasure, because we find that sacrificing for a particular good is better than the pleasure we might get otherwise. That being said, we would say that this is probably the no-thinking default perspective. So if you're standing in line behind an old lady and she happens to drop a $20 bill, she doesn't know that she's dropped it. Nobody else has seen it, and you're the only one there. I'd like to think that you're not just going to pick it up and stick it in your pocket, but we would also know that that will be a temptation, right? Have you seen those prank videos where a guy or a woman is sitting at maybe a park bench or a bus stop, and they set their cell phone next to them and they pretend they're sleeping, and then they wait to see how long somebody comes and steals their phone, and then when the person steals the phone and starts walking away, they have some remote control on it, and they turn it on and electrifies. Have you seen those? Oh, really? Must be, okay, something like that. Maybe what I'm doing is obscure. But, sometimes me and my wife will just be hanging out down at the bar, right? We'll put on these, go on to YouTube, as my wife would say, and then try to find these funny videos. But that's a popular one. I saw another one where a person would leave their bike unlocked up against a tree in a park or something. But what the person who went and stole the bike didn't know is that the back wheel is just kind of on, and it's got like a string or a tether attached to the tree that you really couldn't see. And you see the person take off, and they get about 30 feet away, and the whole thing comes off, and then the person realizes that they were gagged, but they run off because they're ashamed, right? Okay, well, that's the impulse, oftentimes in the human person. How could I take advantage of the situation? So each of those individuals, regardless of what the scenario was, were trying to maximize their pleasure, which they were determining in the moment, all right, and minimize the pain. Here's a bike, I'll steal it, it's for free. There's a phone. That person's asleep. They don't know it. I'll take it. So you're very egocentric, okay? That's typically not an ethical dilemma for most of us. Even if we feel a temptation and such things, we'd still say, well, no, that's not correct to do, right? Not licit, we could probably say. The two forms that your text covered were act and rule consequentialism. And act is not like in the act, it's actually like we're going to determine like what is actually going to be the goods that we're going to weigh out here, right? So how will my group or myself, those actions provide the greatest happiness to all involved? So you see right in the actual name utilitarianism, which is what this is one of utilitarian ethics, is utility. How is this useful to me? So that's always the perspective. It doesn't have to be crass utilitarianism like egocentric consequentialism would, but it's only asking like what is going to happen in the end. That's your major concern. We'll see that this gets a little hard basically to really know well. I'll leave that, like some of the downplays in it. But in medicine, you can see a lot of applications for this, right? I mean, a lot of procedures and treatments are end-oriented. So you're already looking towards a particular goal. It's not the only consideration, but it's a strong consideration. And in a lot of scenarios where ethics is violated, it's somebody trying to achieve the end in spite of the means that they went to do it. So and that's where the ethical dilemma comes. And as somebody says, well, we do it with a good intention, right? So we'll see scenarios later. We'll even talk about them on Thursday. Maybe a particular person says, well, I think my mother would like this. She doesn't speak English. I'm talking for her. I'm representing her. We really know that that's what the mother wants. There's only something that the child is asking for. So the child doesn't feel like they're particularly lying on their parents' behalf. They just think this is really what's best for them, and I can't explain to them. So you're trying whatever you can to subvert the person's, own volition just by trying to achieve an end. So it kind of, in one sense, this makes, like, it sort of rings, there's a truth that rings to it, right? It seems to us like, well, isn't there times when I want to do this? Because, the problem is, and we'll see, especially in, like, paternalism, is that when we were quite young, that's basically how we were raised. Our parents had to make decisions on our behalf. We weren't either competent and have enough information. But this could be abused quite easily. And we'll see a little bit later exactly what some of the issues are involved with it. Let me see if there's any scenarios or anything that I can bring up here. Okay, I guess, like, if I go back to the woman that drops the $20 bill and such, and if the ego consequentialist is going to pick it up because nobody saw it, what if somebody did see it? All of a sudden now you have to start adding that into your measure. Will I deflate somebody else's trust in you in person? And also, I have to be more concerned than just myself, right? So part of the act consequentialism is, I have to kind of evaluate this in terms of everybody else around. What is this woman doing with this? We have no idea. I mean, if we're going to try to maximize the good and minimize the pain for the greatest number of people, what if we found out that woman in front was an elementary school teacher and she was there to buy candy to distribute to the class? All of a sudden now, the amounts of goods go up, and we didn't know that, right? So an ego-centered consequentialist would not consider that. The actual centered consequentialists will have to start taking those things into consideration. So even by their regards, it would not be ethical to take the money, give it back to her. I didn't realize, well, how do you know the person was a school teacher? Who knows? Maybe she's in your town or whatever, or you're old enough and your children have her, and you know that, and you figure she's not here just for herself. Why would a woman that age be in a candy aisle getting all this stuff? It must be for the students, right? So all these things have to be considered. So you're going to work through various things. In other words, you're going to start to analyze the situation. Like if a person was going to utilize this, what are all my options? It's going to be the first thing you're going to do. And then you're going to try to evaluate who will benefit from this and where are the goods going to lie. And then you're going to make a command to maximize those goods. So you're going to work through these ethical scenarios with those things in mind. And there's some application for this. We'll see this, as we move on. Also some issues. Rule consequentialism is a little bit like this, and it's going to be different than what I'm going to show you next. Rule consequentialism is I'm still going to apply the maximum happiness for the maximum number of people, but we're going to use a process of developing rules that they can be applied that will achieve that goal. But these rules are always going to have exceptions, all right? So whatever rule that we can come up with, is this rule applied in our own setting, whether or not it doesn't matter if you're an engineer, a social worker, or a nurse, is the rule that I'm following going to bring the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people? Typically we would say, maybe stealing money that somebody dropped is not a good rule to follow. Maybe there's exceptions, who knows? But the reality is that we would say, as a rule, it's probably good to follow that because, I would not want, if it were my mother, to drop money, and who knows what this person's using it for. So if we're going to throw a rule out there and say this is something we want to follow, this probably is one that we can do, all right? Let's see. I think this one you could apply is the rule of autonomy, which is going to have other applications. What you're going to find with these things is that they're not mutually exclusive, right? So if we compare consequentialism and deontology, they're distinct, but they're going to have sometimes similar outcomes. We might say deontologists and the virtue ethics, ethicists sometimes come up with the same outcomes, sometimes not. And by the way, I'm just giving you a handful. This is not an ethics course per se. So we're only talking about virtue ethics, deontology, consequentialism. Principlism is a little more applied just to nursing. But we can go on and talk about other ethical systems, natural law theory, divine command theory, and such. We go down the list. So there's a lot of different things that people have tried over the years to figure out what is the best thing to do. Ethics is applied philosophy. So since the time of Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics, how you want to pronounce it, they've been trying to figure out what is the best thing to do, which is kind of an interesting thing. Maybe we could say that that's an aspect of personhood we haven't talked about. We really want to do the right thing. Why is that? Not everybody, of course, but I think we're moving that way, in the course of our humanity, right? We're trying to figure out what is the best thing to do. And a lot of these are questions that we've been pondering since, the ancient Greeks, and I'm sure before that, right? Okay, let's see. Here's the problem. If you want to talk about do you kind of get the distinctions here between ego, act, and rule consequentialism? Anything you want me to go over? I thought the reading was pretty clear, but I don't always know how you pick up on that. If you can imagine, again, I'm a visual person, so I try to put these things into visual explanations for myself. If you can imagine that we're trying to weigh out the happiness, the pains and the gains, I think of scale. Well, we're determining how many goods fit on this side of the scale because we're going to try to go in the decision what consequence is going to bring us the greatest happiness. Part of the problem is how do you know that you have all of the evaluations to weigh? You never quite know. In other words, let's say, for instance, that the woman did drop the $20 bill and you go and pick it up and you slide it in your pocket. What if somebody did see that? Did you take into account that you could be actually deteriorating somebody else's faith or trust in the human person? That's not an easy thing to weigh. This is a story that has to do with medical ethics. It's a really good demonstration of it. I wish I could remember the exact scenario, but I can give you the gist of the story to make my point. There was a village in South America on the coast, and the villagers lived a very, simple life. And they were all fishermen. This is how they made their money. But because of their activity of fishing, it was endangering the local reef, to the point where international aid was going to be brought into bear, and they brought a team of people in saying, what can we do? So we're trying to weigh the good and the bad here. We have a people who need to work and who need to make a living, and all have some choice on what they do for that living. But then we have an environmental concern where their activity by earning a living is going to cause harm to this reef and destroy it. So what do we do about this? So what they came up with was an idea, and it sounded like a pretty good idea. And they said, well, these people, I'm making this up just so we have a figure to work with. If they're making $20 a day, and they're working 14 hours a day, that's a long time for a little bit of money. So how about we do this? We'll go in and we will switch their type of livelihood. So we'll go from fishing and we will get everybody that's adults in the village and we will parcel out so many acres of land for every individual, and we will then set them up as banana plantation farmers. So this way they can get them out of the sea. So we're not destroying the reef, but we're also not taking away their ability to earn a livelihood. And because it was set up in an efficient way, they only had to really work like 9 hours a day, and they were making 50% more. So if you're going to weigh all this out, how is this? This is like a no duh, right? We're going from working 14 hours down to 9, and we're going from making $20 a day up to $30 a day, and the reef is saved, and they have a livelihood. I mean, if you wanted to do this from a purely consequential point of view, you're going to achieve your end result, right? What they didn't think of is that these people who were used to working 14 hours a day, were now working 9 hours a day, had 5 hours of leisure time. Guess what they did with their leisure time? They went fishing. And the reef continued to deteriorate. The people who set this up never saw it coming. They just assumed that there was going to be some entrepreneurial Western capitalistic spirit that was going to take these people and they were going to look at the opportunities they had, and somebody was going to spring up and say, hey, how about if I increase my yield by, either figuring out a more efficient way to farm, or I could perhaps buy somebody else's farm, and then I can create a system, and who knows, it's even spread to the region. This was what the hopes were, right? But these people didn't have that sort of issue to deal with. They were just quite content. And now they were told you can make more by working less, and they said, well, let's go and do what we love. What do you love? Fishing. How would you figure that in, right? So this is part of the dilemma with consequentialism, is that when we try to apply it to, as an ethical system to particular things, we never quite know if we have all the goods measured. How can we possibly know that? Even if we have them known now, we can't just say what is good for us in this particular time. We've got to try to foresee to the best of our ability how things might go 20 years from now, 30 years from now. I mean, a lot of the issues that we're dealing with global climate change now, nobody set out when the Industrial Revolution began to destroy our environment. That wasn't the plan. The plan was to do good things. We're going to make things more efficiently. Because we're going to do things in a way that are so efficient, and we can mechanize the process, we're going to drive the cost down so that more people can afford things, and it's also going to create jobs, so many people are going to go work. And what we wound up doing is we wound up having a really high need for low-skilled labor that wasn't translatable to a changing economy. So you have to restructure people as they move on to other things, right? That type of thing. So you see this is part of the issue. It has some good points to it, because a lot of what we do is end-oriented. But we also have to say, are we going to be concerned about the means to get there? If you're a virtue ethicist person, that's one of the first things that's going to come up for you. Okay, I really do like that, but how will this work out in the end, right? Somebody might think that if you can find a way to cheat on a particular exam, is it really that big of a deal? In other words, here's my goal. My goal is to get a degree so I can do this. And I'm going to do plenty of good with my degree. I plan to go do this, and I plan to go do this. Think of all the people that I can help in the course of my life. Is it really worth being concerned about with that little particular incident of an unethical thing? A consequentialist would not typically have a problem with that. Maybe they would. It just depends on how you work the thing out. But, if enough people did that, right, we would start to lose the integrity of the grading system. After a while, we would no longer be able to rely on, does an A mean an A? Does a B mean a B? We won't be quite sure of that, right? You see that with what they normally call like grade inflation in high school. So some universities are no longer looking at, particular grades because they're not much of an indicator really beyond your first year performance in college. And plus, almost everybody has A's. So what do you do with that, right? So it's how would you foresee, like, this is going to be the problem, right? So incomplete evaluation, that's one of the issues with it. The other thing is incommensurability. You guys know what that means? Not everything's worth 10 points. Not everything's worth 8 points. So if you're trying to evaluate two things, I mean, how do we weigh this woman losing $20 to how it might deflate somebody's particular view on human nature? Do we say, well, the $20 is worth 20 and that's just one person, so we're going to give that an 8? I mean, you know, how do you measure things that don't, you know, you can't quantify everything? And this is another problem that we would even have. Even if we go back to the scenario about the South American village, you know, what quantity did we put on the reef compared to their right and ability to make a living in the way that they want? And if we start to say that there's an overarching good on this, I mean, yeah, we probably would agree with that, right? Now, we struggle with this even today, trying to come up with ways to deal with climate issues. You know, somebody could say that we just need to get rid of, like, okay, one course I'm teaching in ethics now, well, we're just on Friday, we're going to have a dialectic about that. And one of the things is that there's some regions, as bad as we would say coal is, you know, these fossil fuels, kind of like, you ever realize that? They always argue about fossil fuels, and that's not where the stuff comes from, right? But everybody still calls it that. But what do you do with particular regions in the country where it's a microeconomy, right? Not microeconomy, it's the soul economy. Parts of Kentucky, this is all they do. You can say, well, let's move it out, but then the entire region is going to be without any sort of means to make a living. Well, we'll bring something else in.
Well, you can just repurpose the production facilities. Like for instance, you can repurpose petroleum fuel facilities into medical grade petroleum product facilities.
If you have the skilled people in the neighborhood, you do that, right? There's something, we won't do it in this class because it's not pertinent enough, but there's something called bridging the mountains, bridging the hills. It's a really cool thing, especially with all the divide that's going on politically. It's Kentucky, literally Kentucky conservatives meeting New England liberals, right? So a New England liberal, she was actually a resolution specialist. That was her deal. And she thought something's wrong with how we're doing this. So what she did was she reached out to these communities in Kentucky, and they started to have dialogue back and forth. And then they just started to understand each other. Nobody changed their positions, which was kind of neat. But it was the one thing, and this is the only point I'm making. You might have a point on how you're portraying it. But the liberal up in New England said we thought that they were voting against their own interests when they were doing to support coal. Once we talked to them, we realized that this is like the sole aspect of their economy, right? The people in Kentucky, it's a little off topic, but it's part of it, right? The people in Kentucky learned something too. They didn't have the same issues with racism and with ethnic issues. Ironically, if you do any study in history in World War II, if you were a coal miner, you couldn't get drafted. That's how critical it was for the war effort. But also, their regions were never segregated. So there was never any racial issues in their particular region of Kentucky that other people experienced because they didn't have to do it. Now the whole point was that the only way that they could know this was by getting in the dialogue. So they learned something. But my point is, like, when we started doing these things, like, you could even have to start measuring, like, how do we measure these things, right? How do we repurpose? Because it does happen sometimes, you know, that you could redo these things. But we're still kind of stuck because if we're evaluating the overall goods and the overall bad effects, we don't quite know what's going to happen. If a particular company moves out, and then you have this property, you have all these people, like my mother-in-law who was, that's how she got into being a medical assistant. She worked for a ribbon factory. The ribbon factory went to another country, and the United States had a program that if your particular position goes overseas, or at least out of the country, that they will give monies for you to learn a new trade. So they all went off and did everything. No guarantee on position and such. But how do you measure all those things, right? I mean, all you can really hope for is that this works. Which maybe is why we should be a little lenient with some politicians. And trust me, for me to say that, I almost want to stop myself. Because you don't always know the fallout of these things. Sometimes we can only work with foreseeable consequences. So, I think that would be in a consequentialist defense. You can't expect them to go farther than the greatest minds can do. But we still have to keep in the back of our heads that we don't really know. All the best that we can hope for is that we figure this out right, and then in the course of us doing this, we're actually working in an ethic way, all right? Anyway, any questions on consequentialism? Again, it's kind of a drive-by on it, but... Okay. Let's look at deontology. Deontology was, brought by Immanuel Kant. So if you know anything about Immanuel Kant, he's a rationalist, as opposed to an empiricist. So he wanted to come up with a way that we can be ethical only by using reason alone. So no import of, at the time, his region Christianity or anything else. Let's think, could we come up with a way to determine what would be right action and without looking at the consequence? So this isn't asking what the end is going to be. This starts out by saying, what is the right rule to follow, which is built into the word, Deon and such. So only human reason, nothing else per se, all right? And if you go even farther, right, if you remember, you used to have philosophy courses here, the empirical method, right, was a posteriori, so it's all like an inductive empirical method. This is a priori. How can I know something before experience, okay? So there's some things that, Kant said you could know from experience, and most of us would, maybe agree. So if I were to tell you that the internal angle of the triangle has to equal 180 degrees, you don't quite need experience to know that, right? If I were to tell you all bachelors are unmarried single men, you don't need experience to know that, right? So there was nothing new for that for Kant. So that's why those things were called, synthetic applications or synthetic propositions. What he wanted to get at was, can we really know something new? So if I were, if I were to say all bodies are extended, that's just a synthetic statement. I mean, a body by itself extends somewhere. I mean, you're not giving me anything. If I were to say all bodies are heavy, now I'm adding something new. How can you know something like that? So he tried to apply this, and it's his famous, synthetic a priori, method. How can we pull this out into reason? So what he came up with was, he came up with this idea that we can form what's known as a categorical imperative, okay? So just inherent in this term is that, first of all, it's categorical. It's not hypothetical. Hypothetical is not really making a judgment per se. It's almost like an observation, if you want to call it that. There's more to it, but it's not important for us to go over. So categorical means without exception, and imperative means it's a command. So here we have a command of reason, and he says, how can we do this? Now he's came up with different, variations on this. It's not important for us to try to break down the variations. But he came up with a maxim, right? Act only from a maxim that can be willed to be universal law. So in other words, if you are trying to determine what is it that is the right thing for me to do here and do now, then start by asking, if I do this, can I will everybody do it? And if I can will everybody to do it, then maybe it's something that I can go ahead and do myself. So if a person were to say, should I cheat on a particular exam? Well, if I say that I'm allowed to do that, then I'm going to have to say everybody's allowed to do it. And we know that that would wreak havoc on, the integrity of the system. So a deontologist would have to say, no, I cannot do that, right? What if I think this person, could I murder this person indiscriminately? It's a pretty easy one, but the way he works it out is, well, no, but then I have to allow everybody to murder who they want indiscriminately. And of course, that's anarchy. And you keep working this out like this. So what he thinks and what he proposes is that just through reason alone, we can work this out in dialogue. And we can come up with deontological approaches. Now, we do this in medical ethics. We'll talk a little bit about that as we move on here. But there's also issues.
A little off topic. What I remember, is this the tool that Kant used to reason that we can't actually know, in the a priori sense, that someone else is actually who they are inside someone else's body? Or is that a different argument?
Yeah, I would think that's a different argument.
Okay.
Yeah. this would come from, like, I'm trying to think where that, I'm trying to think of the scenario on that, but I think it's a different argument, at least that. But, okay, look at how this contrasts, though, with the utilitarian consequential ethics. You're not even looking at the consequence. In other words, you're going to do the right thing according to your categorical imperative in spite of the outcome. It doesn't much matter, all right? It's going to be in direct conflict with those things. It doesn't mean that sometimes you might not wind up with the same evaluation, because sometimes it's how things work out. But you're never starting there. So the first thing when you're hit with an idea is not like, well, how will this play out? All you start out with is this something that I can reason from, and through reason declare that this is a universal thing. Some of the things seem like, you know, it'd be like, again, it's a simple conclusion. I'm not going to murder, all right? I'm not going to lie. Maybe you would say if you're in an exclusive relationship, you have to honor that, right? Because we can't break down trust. And you can start working your way out. And that's how Kant did. We'll see that there's issues with that, but that's pretty much how he worked it out. Now, something, and by the way, these are without exceptions. Okay, that's an important thing to remember. Because if you're going to allow an exception in a particular case, then who's determining these exceptions? And you can see, too, this is different than rule-centered consequentialism. Rule-centered consequentialism isn't a maxim that can be universally willed. It's what rule can come up with that's going to give us all the most pleasure and the least amount of pain. Kant says, no, we're going to come up with a rule. We're not even worrying about the pain and pleasure variables. All we're worrying about is it the right thing to do, and can we know only from reason alone? And once we have that, then we don't need any other information. We'll just stick to our guns on that. Now, I think this is called, in the text, something a little different than I have it listed here. Let me see. Yeah, I think it's the respect principle, but it's the same thing. This is not exclusive to Kant, but it was also something that came from his reason alone. Treat other human persons only as an end in themselves and never as a means to an end. All right? Now, this isn't a half-bad principle. So when you're helping somebody in the healthcare field, you know, well, how about this? And I think it even mentions in the text, when people submit themselves to trials, pharmaceutical trials, there's a lot of rules that have to govern that. In other words, is this trial, is the person allowed to get out? Is the person fully informed? Somebody might say, yeah, but if they're fully informed on everything that we're giving them, it could affect the outcome. It doesn't matter. You can't use somebody as a means to an end. It doesn't matter how good the end is. If you said, but we're doing this, and something good is going to come out of it, it's a very little sacrifice that we're going to have to deal with, that's consequentialism, all right? There's a new book that came out, and I tried to look it up, but I could have sworn I heard it them called the food bomb. But apparently there's like a diet or something that matches. Every time I try to search it, I get confused. But what happened was, before we had the FDA and such, it's unbelievable the stuff that they would put into foods. So when you had this transition of people who always grew their own stuff and produced their own, you name it, butter, milk, because they had their own, goats or cows. When you started the transition that people were buying this from others, there was a lot of deceptive practices. And this person who wrote this book was laying it all out. In other words, if you wanted to sell more milk, but you couldn't produce more milk, what would you think your opportunities are? What would you try to do? Come on, where's our deceptive criminal minds in the crowd? Let's say you have 100 gallons of milk, and the price is fixed. You really can't do much with that, but you want to sell more. What can you do to this milk to get more?
Put water in it?
There you go. But see, you're nice. You're only going to put water in it, right? So,
For chocolate and chocolate.
There's an entrepreneur. Well, the people were adding, so they were thinning it out, right? And they were using water, but they weren't always using purified water. So what people were finding was, why are there worms growing in my milk? Okay? Now, when you add water to milk, I mean, okay, if you don't drink whole milk, and if you drink like 2% or skim, what's the difference just in looking at them, and if you shake them a little, what's the difference between the two? It's what? It's blue, different color. It also looks thinner and such, right? So they said we need a way to get the yellow back, right? We got to get the coloring back. So they would add yellow lead to these things. They also found that there was no days before the preservatives that we have today. This stuff was getting sour. So if you not only could sell more milk by thinning it out and then recapturing the color by adding some yellow lead, you also had to be concerned, what if they liked your milk because your milk lasted longer? So they would add formaldehyde to this stuff, right? Okay, now, there was a well-meaning scientist who just said this practice has to stop. But they didn't have our science data that we have today. They didn't know that lead was bad like that. What would be the effect of formaldehyde? Because it certainly does preserve things, right? So he had to find out ways to figure out what is good and what is bad. So he started, and this is where the testing came in with human subjects. He started testing various levels of this stuff on human subjects. So he can figure out at what point does it really cause problem. And you would get paid for this. So it wasn't like but you didn't really know what was in it. You had no idea what effect was going on. So you had guys who were out of work trying to make money for their families, and all of a sudden they have such intestinal problems, they're vomiting all over the place and everything else is going on. And they don't know what's affecting, right? So we learned a lot from that. But we learned a lot from that at the expense of people who had to suffer through it. A consequentialist would probably come up, and you don't have to be crass about it, but didn't we all benefit from a very small group? I mean, really, is that a big problem? I mean, aren't we glad of it? So a consequentialist might make the argument that maybe you don't like to admit it, but you do like the fact that we've all done this, right? The deontologist would just stop it from the get-go. You cannot use another human being as a means to an end, full stop, right? So we might say, if you're a virtue ethicist, you might say, I agree with you, Kant. Now there you go. So so like I'm saying, one or two more ethical systems could be concurring in their conclusions on what they say is not ethical, even if they take different approaches to it, okay? So, as bad as it sounds, that's what it is. Here's the thing. First of all, there are no exceptions. So, the classic example of deontology, this is the classic, if you took a philosophy course and they talk about deontology and they'd say this, you almost got gypped, okay? It's 1943, and you're in Germany, and you're a fine Catholic family, and some Jews came to your house and said, hi, listen, you said, get into the basement. And then 3 days later, Nazis come banging on the door. Do you have any Jews in here that you are hiding? What do you do as a deontologist? What do you do? Do you lie? Well, you're not supposed to lie, but you have another duty, to protect the innocent. Oh my God. I mean, this is almost like if you're a deontologist and you're a pure deontologist, you're in a freaked out moment because you have conflicting duties and I don't know what to do. It's like, what do you do here, right? So, without exceptions, that's going to be part of the problem. Actually, I'm throwing both these together because the second one is, do you have conflicting duties and such? But there are times where, look, the application of this is not going to work in our particular situation. So we really have to consider, maybe we should set this one to the side. We'll see in doing practical ethics that autonomy, in other words, autonomy is a big thing. It's the primary thing in nursing. You're an advocate for this person. But we're going to see scenarios on Thursday where we're going to respect that person's autonomy, and even if they are in sound mind, but if it gets to the point where we see them doing serious harm, then we're going to seek, legal means to overcome their autonomy. That's not going to be the deontologist's position. They're going to say, we totally agree that you should not use people as a means to an end, but if autonomy, respecting that person is what you call a rule, stick to it. And we'll see there's going to be some scenarios that we're going to even say in an ethical way, professional ethical way, that we can't do that. Right? we're going to have to go to court to try to overturn this, that type of thing. So that's a problem. So you have a little bit that there's no exception, so it's very inflexible. And also that what do we do when duties conflict? That type of thing. Questions on deontology? All right. Principlism is something, and don't worry about the people that came up with it. It's not important for us to recall that. But you're going to see these terms before. This is something that we already talked about as it applies to the medical field. So what they did was they tried to take a lot of the varying ethical systems and see how does this work out in nursing. And the first one they would come up with is autonomy. And you could almost see a deontological backing for that. Non-maleficence, do no harm, all right? You can see a consequential backing in that. Beneficence, do good. You can almost see, maybe I'm stretching it, a virtue, I think, implied within that, right? And justice, everybody gets their due, right? I mean, you can't be everywhere all the time. You can't answer all the blinking lights at your station at the same time. So this isn't a matter of just being equity, that everybody gets 5 minutes with me when that particular patient needs more of you than the other one. Again, you show up at an emergency room on the bad part of the day and you have a sprained ankle, bring a book, because you're going to be there for a while. And that's not unjust. You might not like it, but it's not unjust. So all they did was grab these things and then say, how can we apply various ethical systems so that it's not just practical, but that they're good guides, and we're going to be principle-based, right? Now, there's issues with this too, because just because there's a principle out there is like a rule or a consequence. It doesn't just solve the issue, and nobody should ever think of ethics as some sort of, magic 8-ball. I know it's an older thing from the 70s and 80s, but you know what I mean? You would shake the 8-ball, and then there was like a dice inside, it would float to the top, and it would ask it a question and tell you what to do. Well, you can't do this with ethics. You can't just have like a box where you insert all my data, and then poof, something's going to pop out at the other end and give me instructions on how to move forward. A lot of this, okay, it isn't that we don't have provisions that we had in the past, like things that have already happened that have helped us develop these things. But there's always new stuff that comes up, all right? So with autonomy, I've already sort of mentioned it with the deontology. Is that absolute? It can't be absolute. If it's absolute, you might have to let a mother not treat her 4-year-old because she doesn't agree with the treatment, and the child might die. You can't just assert the conscient principle of autonomy there. There has to be some other recourse that we have, and we'll talk about that in professional ethics on Thursday. So, again, we're not out of the woods just by saying that you now get a principle to work for. Are we all good? Non-maleficence. Well, let's just say there's a lot of things that happen in medicine that create harm. And sometimes that harm is the path to healing. The very least of which might be a medicine that causes severe side effects, and without it, you may not have quality of life or a longevity of life. So you're going to have to balance those things out, right? So if we're going to say that we don't want to cause harm, what are we talking about? You guys know the old phrase, there is no drug without a side effect, right? So we're always weighing this out. So we can't just use that as a flat-out principle. Now we're going to talk more about this in a sec. But beneficence, it almost sounds like we've all agreed on what is good. In other words, even with Kant, and he says, if we're going to have this categorical imperative based on reason, based on whose version of good? Because some people might deem in honor that they do accept the death rather than the treatment for life. It might be a sign of weakness in a particular culture. Well, should we allow that? And what we're calling good, they may not be calling good. It doesn't mean, we do this all the time. right? Let me just back up 1 second. One thing that we should get over is to think that somehow every time we have an ethic, it's an imposition of something on us. There's no neutral ethic, right? So if, I had a student last semester that, her mother, they were refugees in the United States because her mother was in a region in the world where they did female genital mutilation, okay? Well, okay, do you understand how we call that an evil? But particularly in that region, they did it. So is our calling that an evil an imposition on their autonomy and their good? Well, yes, we would say so, but we're making a call, okay? We're saying that this is what's good and that's not good. Also, we're going to have to know something about human nature. Because if we're going to say something is good for the human person, are we just talking about goods that are, biologically good? We're incarnate beings, right? I mean, we have a lot of emotions and feelings and those that express a faith. There's a lot of spiritual and physical and mental dimensions to us that all have to be considered in this. This isn't just fixing a biological problem, right? You're never treating a pathology, you're always treating a person. That was part of the idea. So then, if we're going to say that we're only treating a person and not the pathology per se, then we have to determine what's good for the human person. To determine what's good for the human person is going to mean that we are going to come up with some sort of aspect of a nature. Or at least, even if you're not going to do that, you're still going to go back to the point where we're determining what values are good for this person. Right? And then we're not out of the woods there because who's determining what values are good? If we were in a region where genital mutilation was the norm and we were the minority, would we then have to give into that as a good because that's what was deemed as a good for that particular culture? So every ethical decision is an imposition on something. Every time you go to a stop sign and stop your car, it's an imposition. But it's an imposition for some other aspect of freedom, right? We get to consider. All my only point is that we're not out of the woods just by declaring this. And with justice, there's going to be instances where we conflict. Justice that's happening in think of a medical clinic, right? I'll give you an example. So we're going to talk more about this particular subject on Thursday with socioeconomic instances. But I was talking to this person who was a medical technician in a clinic, and oftentimes she realized that the identifications and cards that were given to her were fraudulent, right? So these people were undocumented. What do? You've got a conflicting issue there. It doesn't mean the fact that they're undocumented doesn't mean they don't need medical care. But you can't just pass all this over. There's, that's something else that has to be worked out. Now, the likelihood of there's a nurse that happening to you that's probably going to be taken care of by somebody else. But, this person was not a nurse. She was a medical technician, and she was the one dealing with all of this. And so what do you do with these conflicting things, right? This is part of the problem. Okay. What does this go to? 2:15? Yeah, we won't be here that long. You glad for that? Any questions on that? These are just, we did virtue ethics, we've done consequentialism, and these give you two varieties. Forget about egoism, nobody really is going to entertain that. But we will have to talk about rule and act consequentialism. And deontology, which is kind of straightforward, and then also just this principle of respect for the human person. And then principlism, which those four elements you should have seen before, okay? Now, what's not covered in your book, and it's very important, which kind of always wonders why it's not in there, but nonetheless, it sort of falls under this principle of non-maleficence. Have you ever heard of the principle of double effect? Anybody? Okay, this came out of the Catholic Church. It was formulated pretty much by Thomas Aquinas, but secular ethics has picked it up. So if I know my one daughter showed me, if you do the Quizlets or whatever on, the internet, this showed up underneath the principle of non-maleficence, so it fits right in. What Thomas Aquinas was trying to work out was, we use different names. We use the word, we talk about terms. when we were talking about logic and how important the term is. The term often identifies what the action is. And the term is based on a lot of other criteria. For instance, Thomas Aquinas would say, if you took a weapon out and killed somebody for reasons that you want their money, or if they were bothering you and just an annoyance, we call that murder. We use the term murder to identify that. If that person was coming at you with a weapon, and you had a weapon, and in the process of you defending yourself, you killed that person, we don't call that murder. We call that self-defense, right? Physically, the whole thing looks the same. I mean, somebody's dying, and we don't know the intentions back there. But this would be the difference between if somebody was on your front yard, yelling at you, calling you all kinds of names, and you went out with a gun and shot him. Get used to, your new outfit because you're going to prison, right? But if the person was in your house and coming at you, and your life was imminently threatened, depending on your state laws, it's not worried about arguing that, and you shot that person, you were just in self-defense, even though the physicalities of the act look the same. So in other words, Thomas Aquinas worked out 4 conditions for us to determine when is this happening. And medical ethics has picked it up, at least in the last 30 to 40 years. So the reason why we apply this is we're in an action that has at least 2 effects. It's not just, and they're not all good. We intend one of them, one's unintended. The only thing that you need to add to this definition is the unintended is foreseen. It's not, I didn't see it coming. In other words, if the person comes into your house and they're threatening you with, death, and you shoot them, yes, you foresee harming them and possibly killing them. That's not, gee, I wonder what's going to happen here, all right? But you didn't really intend it. In other words, by that, now somebody might say, well, yeah, you really did. No, in a perfect world, if you had such power, you would have stopped the whole thing. You don't want this person to die. There's no other way for you to get the one good, which you're really after, which is self-protection. And their death is a foreseen but unintended consequence of you trying to preserve your own life, all right? There's 4 conditions, and then we're going to apply some so you can get it. The first thing is the act has to be at least morally, ethically good or neutral, okay? So you could not apply the principle of double effect to somebody going out in their front yard and just shooting somebody because they didn't like them. Okay, no. We can determine by other ethical means that is illicit. So we're not even going to consider that type of thing, all right? If somebody wanted to go in and talk to the doctor and say, can you please amputate my arm? For no reason. Well, this is not a good, all right? There's no reason to amputate your arm. That's not how this is going to work, all right? And, there instances like that. We'll talk about body dimorphic illnesses and such, psychological things, okay? The second is, the good effect cannot come from the bad effect. I know it's going to sound a little convoluted, but the bad effect of perhaps taking another person's life wasn't the cause of you preserving yours. It was just a necessary means to get there, all right? It's easier. Maybe just, if you have a question about that, hold off until we start applying this to like side effects of pharmaceuticals, because it's easier to grasp that way. I'm just going to give you the 4 elements right now. The effect has to be proportionate, all right? So, even if the person was in your house and they were just like waving their arms and calling you all kinds of names, the reason why under PDE you could not harm that person is because there's nothing disproportionate there, right? Or, let's say this, they're threatening you, I'm going to take your TV, you go. Now let's forget about your right to hold property, let's put it aside. Okay, you couldn't weigh, now you're weighing things. Me losing my television isn't the same as that person losing their life. That would be disproportionate. But if you're defending your own life against somebody else, that's a direct proportion, right? My life and their life are equal. And again, just hold off until we put this into some sort of scenario that might help. And the last one is you foresee it, but you don't intend it. And by intended, it means if you had the power, you would change it. Okay? here's a scenario. There are some pain medications if a person is dying. So I should say a few things. When we work through ethical scenarios, we have to keep it simple. That doesn't mean that we can't apply it to more complex ones. It just means that over the course of the years of me doing this, if I allow a student to say, what about this? It changes things sometimes. And I found the other classmate, I've heard what they're talking about, next thing you know, they're thinking I'm answering something else. So we just keep the scenario simple, and we keep it very case specific. It just makes it simpler, clearer. So if you have a woman who's dying, I mean, the chances of this woman lasting another week or two, it is not good. I mean, it's almost 100%. She's obviously going to die, and probably will die within the week. But she's under a lot of pain. So a pain medication can be administered to this individual, but it's probably going to hasten death. So she will die sooner, but in less pain. Okay. So now you might be thinking this isn't a moral dilemma, but it's an ethical scenario that you have to work out. The principle of double effect could be applied to that. So we'd have to start by asking, what are we doing? Okay, so when you ask, what are you doing? If you took a moral or an ethical class, we would work out, it's called the object. Don't write this down, because it's just an FYI, so you get where I'm going with this. It's known as the object of the act, the finis operis. What is going on? So a person who just went out in the front yard and shot somebody, the finis operis there was murder. The person was in their house defending themselves, and the person died in the midst of them defending themselves, the finis operis is self-defense. Okay? So the term matches up. So when we say, what happened? We can't look at the physicality of it, right? Because in this instance, all we would know is that, I mean, the difference between this and direct euthanasia, direct involuntary euthanasia, the doctor is going like this and not telling anybody. The physicality of the act could be the same, all right? And it could be, and this is why we're not switching it, it could be that the doctor just wants to get the woman out of the room. So I'm going to do this so that the woman dies. They would all look the same. So we're going to keep it simple, and we're going to say the woman is in severe pain. She's got a week to live. If he administers this drug, she will be comfortable, but she will die sooner. What is the doctor doing? What is the main goal or object? What is he after? What's he want to do? Well, not even the death part. All he wants to do is control her pain. That's all he's doing. He's only controlling his pain. So we're going to say, that's good. When you control somebody's pain, that's a good thing. The good effect cannot be through the bad effect. Okay. Controlling pain is not the cause of the person's death. Now, I know you're probably thinking in the back of your head, yeah, what the medicine is. The only goal you have is to control this person's pain, all right? You foresee the effect, all right? You foresee it. So the effect, we got in the fourth one. If you had, in the way you think this, if the physician were God, and he could do this without her dying early, he would do it that way. I mean, he has no control over that. He realizes it's a foreseen effect. The effect must be proportionate. Okay, a hastened death is not going to be valued as high as comfort, all right? So at this point, we're after comfort. So we're going to say this is a good thing to do, right? We're going to administer this drug. And this is how the physician would talk to the family members, right? She's in a lot of pain. It's hard to say. I mean, they'll say, my guess is that she would live a week like this, maybe a little longer, absolutely no longer than that. In our experience, we can keep her comfortable. The medicine has a side effect, and the side effect is that it could hasten death in this particular instance. But it will give her a pain-free existence until that time comes. Most family members are going to say yes, we would agree with that. But see, you're doing some harm there, aren't you? Remember what I said. It's like, but the harm that we're doing is not proportionate to the good that we're trying to do. Oh, so then it's just relative. No, it's not just relative. We're not just weighing these things out, right? We're saying that our overall, what our goal is not to kill her. Our goal is to make her comfortable. We foresee that in the midst of us trying to achieve that goal, that it'll probably hasten her death. most people would go for that, all right? So, I'm gonna do another scenario. Did you kind of get that now? Are you still, you look confused back. You're gonna get something, what? No.
It's just, yeah, no, it's just kind of like, they kind of work towards themselves there, I don't know, I guess it's just like, it's about the initial, I'm thinking back to the initial murder, like, or initial, like, or something
Yeah.
that comes in trying to kill you.
Well, how it'd be here is if a doctor set out, now you wouldn't know this, right, because it's gonna be an internal note, but say a doctor set out that I would like this patient doesn't seem to be in excruciating pain, but they're in pain. So you know I'm gonna go and do this so that the patient dies sooner.
Yeah, I'm just saying, like, you foresee that coming, but like, you also, that is, foreseeing is knowing, I don't know.
But the object would change there. See, all of a sudden, if a physician did do that, and I know we don't know people's inner thoughts, but if a physician did do that, knowing that this would, look, let's say to everybody, you know, healthcare money, free up beds, what's the difference between 7 days and 4 days? You know, so I'm going to go and tell the family that I'd like to do this, and I think it's in their best cause. That's involuntary act of euthanasia, right? The whole thing changed, and then you couldn't know that. But to be honest, it isn't like it hasn't happened. There's enough court case where people have done stuff like that, right? So
The second step makes it challenging.
it is. We're not trying to solve. Here's another application. Let's see if this helps. Okay. So if a woman, she's pregnant, right? So she has a confirmed pregnancy, and she's been diagnosed very early within that pregnancy with an aggressive form of uterine cancer. So she goes to her physician and the oncologist, and they say, if we hold off until the child's born, the likelihood of you making it through 6 months, even with, you know, aggressive, you know, treatment, is slim. If we act now, there's a chance that we can really catch this. At the very least, give you a fighting chance for 5, 8 years. I mean, and who knows what will happen in treatments between now and then, all right? Okay. If they do that, and the doctor explains to her that the fetal life will not survive this treatment, or we're going to have to remove this organ, right? What the physician is doing is treating her cancer. That's the object of the act. That's what they're doing. The good effect, it's not, the death of the child doesn't cause the woman's cancer to be cured. All right? By the way, and I'll say this, if you're absolutely opposed to abortion, and you've heard people say, you know, that you don't allow abortion to the life of the mother, you can't even get into those arguments unless you understand PE. Okay, and I'll explain that in a second. So the good effect, so we realize that the death of the child doesn't cause the woman's cancer to be cured. The effect must be proportionate. Yes. Even if you're of the ilk that you believe that the unborn child is a human person, we also believe the woman is a human person. So we have 100% here proportionality. There's not even a question of that. The foreseen bad effect must not be intended. Again, if you were God, there's something you can do. If there were a way to treat this, not like, well, this kind of works, but it was the exact, you know, treatment, efficient efficacy, let's say it that way, and you could take it. Okay. That woman gets the treatment, obviously the organ's removed, the fetal life perishes in the operation. That's not an abortion. Now, in, let's say, in pedestrian language, that's all you're going to hear. It's not an abortion because the act was not an intended, no one intended that fetal life to be terminated. Yes, but they knew it was going to happen. Yes, it was foreseen. Yes, but they could have not done anything. Then the woman would have died. So it was proportionate. So a person, what I'm saying is if you're adamantly opposed to abortion, this would be permissible under the principle of double effect. And if somebody were to say, well, then you agree with abortions, no, I don't. You can still make that argument, right? I mean, this is why, under no circumstances do I get into discussions on social media or out in the street about these things. You can never do it, right? You can never do it because you'd be working all this thing. in even way, the life of the mother, like you hear that sometimes, right? Like, we need to be concerned with the life of the mother. But we normally think life of the mother means she'll die. Has anybody ever read Doe v. Bolton? Life of the mother could be emotional, distraining, doesn't have the finances for the child, right? So we're not here to work all that out. All we're here is to say that the application of the principle of double effect, in this case, should be on everybody's table as perfectly fine, right? A person who argues against this, I don't care what their stance is, what are you talking about, right? So anytime you have like an extrauterine pregnancy, you know, these are the cases that arise. And a person, and by the way, if any of you go and work at a Catholic hospital, you're going to be in the midst of this, right? You may not have the issues that you think, because they will treat that woman under the principle of double effect. And if somebody comes back and says, okay, but now you said this, they're going to, unless you have a moral theologian there that's going to explain the difference between the finis operis and the finis operantis, which nobody here is going to care about, the intention and the object, you know, we're going to say those aren't the same thing. And if you're not quite convinced on that, just go back and think about shooting somebody in your front yard and shooting somebody who's trying to kill you. You know, if somebody would argue, you still killed him. Yes. Well, then that's murder. No, it's not. Yes, it is. You killed him. I mean, do you see how you would still get in that same argument? And the whole time you'd be going, I'm going to hit somebody because nobody's listening, that kind of thing, right? So the principle of double effect falls under this, you know, non-maleficence in the sense that there are times when in the process of treating, you have to cause harm. Anytime you, if a person has a gangrene foot because of diabetes, you're going to amputate the foot. Is amputating the foot a good thing? No. But it's better than having the disease spread and that person dies from gangrene. So for the principle of double effect, you would work out the proportion, losing a foot, losing a life. I think we're good with the foot, right? Is the action good or neutral? I'm preserving this individual's life, that's good. I foreseen, did you know that the foot was going to be amputated? Of course, that was the whole purpose, right? So I didn't intend it. If I were God, and we could have healed that foot, if there was like some, you know, diabetic ulcer, and we could have healed it some other way, we would have done so, right? So you couldn't treat medicine if you didn't have some way to work out that we're doing harm, but yet we're doing harm for a greater good without just being a pure consequentialist, right? That type of thing. Make sense? Lot to digest? All right. Have a great day, guys.